My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
Analogy. For our purposes, we're going to be talking about three types of analogy. There's metaphor, simile, and cliche. So a metaphor, of course, is where two distinct concepts are treated as though they were the same. So love poetry loves to do this. So Bartholomew Griffin, for example, wrote, "My lady's hair is threads of beaten gold." Similes are similar, except for, in this case, the two distinct concepts are overtly compared, usually with a like or as. So again, with Bartholomew Griffin's line, "Her smiles and favors sweet as honey bee." Now, a cliche starts as a metaphor or simile, but it becomes frozen so that when we hear the metaphor or simile, we no longer actually think of the two distinct concepts. We go straight to the concept that's actually being discussed. So for example, when we say now, "She has rosy cheeks," I don't think that most of us actually picture roses in that case. We just picture cheeks that are somewhat flushed. Right? So once a metaphor or simile becomes frozen like that and becomes cliche, it really loses its strength. It loses the original insight that led us to use a metaphor or simile. And I would argue at that point, they're really not worth using. But I do want to stress how useful analogy in general can be. So for example, nominalizations, which I've talked about in other videos, and they usually get lambasted, and we talk about how terrible they are. And they can be terrible, but they can also be really useful. That it is a sort of metaphor. What I mean is that it gives thinghood to an action, an experience, an emotion, a characteristic. It gives concreteness to something that isn't concrete. So for example, think is not even really action. It's something that happens cognitively that we can't witness. But as soon as we turn it into a nominalization, thought, it suddenly takes on this existence out there in the world. Same thing with education or construction or happiness or intelligence, which we now think of as something that is quantifiable. But it took that leap for people to think that you could go from describing a person as being intelligent to actually thinking that they possessed something that you could quantify. Some have argued that science needs this metaphor to progress. I would argue that it needs this metaphor to progress. Science does, in fact, love nominalizations. Analogies are also useful in another way. It helps us to understand complex ideas by framing them in familiar terms. For example, when I was in graduate school, the internet 2.0 was just taking off, and chat rooms were all the rage. And for linguists, that was a goldmine, because we could go in there and take real-world occurring data and search on it and do all sorts of fun things with it that we never could usually. It revolutionized the way that we started thinking about doing our work. But there was a big question, is the morality of it. Could we actually use chat room data? And there were two metaphors that were brought forth. One was that a chat room is equivalent to a conversation in a coffee shop. In that case, there's no expectation of privacy. So when you're in a coffee shop, if somebody is sitting at the next table over, they can hear what you're saying. And therefore, if that person sitting at the other table is a linguist, they can actually take notes on what you're saying. They can't record you without your permission, but they can take notes on what they're hearing because you have no expectation of privacy. A chat room Could be that, or alternatively, it could be a conversation in a house that you had to be invited into that conversation, and it's occurring in a private room, not in a public space. In that case, you do have an expectation of privacy, and a linguist can't go into a chat room under that analogy and lurk. That would be like being out there in the rose bushes and eavesdropping through a window. That's not legal. Now, as I understand it, this question became moot because the platforms actually claimed that they owned all of that data and they could sell it if they so chose. Okay, another sort of conundrum, this is in the courts, can police put trackers on people's cars without a warrant? This came up to the Supreme Court some years ago, and two analogies were drawn. So the police, on one side, said that this is similar, putting a tracker on a car, is similar to a police officer surreptitiously following the car, which is perfectly legal. But the ACLU and others argued that a tracker is the same as a police officer searching the car. It's too invasive. And in fact, the Supreme Court came down more on the latter, that it wasn't just simply following the car, it was more of a search, in which case they needed authorization from a court. Okay, other sorts of analogies. The human mind is a computer. That analogy has dominated psychology and linguistics, for that matter, since the 1950s. It has given us a lot of insight into the human mind, but it's also at times led us astray. And that's also a challenge, is you got to have good metaphors, and not all metaphors are good, or our understanding, for example, of what a computer is has changed over time, and those changes have changed the way that we think about the human mind. My favorite is that the universe is shaped like a donut. That kind of scratches two itches for me. I am really fascinated by theories of the origins of the universe, and I'm also very fascinated with donuts, which are the perfect food. Okay, now we're going to be thinking about cliches, because the problem with cliches is that they lead us astray sometimes, and the images become too frozen, so that then we forget that we're using a cliche, and we end up using two or more at the same time. And that's just boggling for a reader. This is one of my favorites. This is something I heard on NPR many years ago now, but it just stuck with me. So a woman was talking about women advancing in high positions in companies. And she said, standing on the glass ceiling is like Swiss cheese. You have to poke holes in it to let in the air. So all sorts of strange things there, like standing on ceilings, comparing ceilings to cheese, and then also obviously not understanding how Swiss cheese works. But anyways, it just, that confoundment of images really struck in my mind, not in a good way. These are collected on a website. The first one is a newspaper headline: "The Assassin's Knife Clouds France's Skies." Another one, for whatever reason, sports announcers really love mixed metaphors. "We'll just have to see if they can keep this Cinderella slipper alive." And then this one, apparently this was written by a student in a class paper. "Philip Freneau had one foot in the 18th century, while with the other he hailed the dawn of a new day." These are collected on a different site. "The tech wreck is already starting to infect the entire stock market." "The forces that fed on themselves and helped NASDAQ to go to the moon are feeding on themselves on the downside too." "A cloudy earnings picture could short circuit the rally."